Thank you, Eider, for your kind words. And well, let me set the time just in case. Okay, and I would also like to thank Amaia, David, and Angel for organizing this conference, and you for being here. So today I'll be talking about migration to the US, and specifically about Latinx migrants as portrayed in the novels by Reyna Grande and Diane Guerrero. So first of all, I'm going to give you some background, some data, then I'm going to introduce both authors, and then I'm going to focus on the American dream, having undocumented status in the US, family unity, that impact on mental health, and then some conclusions. So since this is a conference on the American West, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So as we all know, Latinxes have been part of the US, or they've been in the US for many, many years. But also there are many people from Latin America who migrate to the US. And in fact, migration patterns have been changing in recent decades. More women and more children are migrating. And this is why experts argue that we need to take a family-centered approach when assessing migration. Well, due to many reasons, nowadays there are over 11 million undocumented people. And I have to say here that not all of them belong to the Latinx community. And particularly after the Trump administration, many migrants have been racialized and criminalized, and Latinxes have been a clear target of that. Now, being undocumented has an impact on a person's life and at many different levels. So undocumented people tend to hold worse social status. They are more likely to live in poverty. And within a family, there may be different situations. So there may be a family where all family members are documented, or where all family members are undocumented. But in some cases, we may have different statuses. And this is called mixed status family, right? And nowadays, there are over 16 million people living in this type of families. And even if we may think that being documented and undocumented are completely different things, which they are, of course, when there are different legal statuses within the same family, all family members, to some extent, experience the consequences of undocumented status. And this is called multi-generational punishment, a term that was coined by sociologist Laura Enriquez, and is defined as a distinct form of legal violence wherein the sanctions intended for a specific population spill over to negatively affect individuals who are not targeted by laws. So multi-generational punishment, as Enriquez notes, may last for many, many generations. And in general terms, within these mixed status families, all family members tend to avoid presence in the public sphere. They tend to live in what is commonly known as in the shadows, which obviously affects their sense of belonging to the home country, and has many different implications, and this is particularly, or could be particularly, detrimental for children of migrants and for their mental health, as many studies have shown. So as we see, there is a strong connection between migration and mental health, and indeed, many mental health professionals, such as Spanish psychiatrist Joseba Chotegui, have studied migrant mental health, migrant grief, and so on. And well, I don't have time to develop that here, but it's a very, very interesting topic. And well, as you may know, in the last decade, children of migrants and the undocumented youth in the US have been at the heart of the immigration debate. There have been different legal measures and attempts to improve their situation, such as the proposition of the DREAM Act by the Obama administration, which wasn't passed. Then DACA was implemented, then overturned by the Trump administration. That decision was rescinded by the Supreme Court. And currently, the people who were who benefited from the DACA program are sort of in a legal limbo. And this group, due to their psychosocial features, they've been really active. They've taken to the streets. They've been active on social media, and they've also shared their stories and their communities' ideas across different cultural productions. And a good example of that is literature. We have some examples here. The first two memoirs are the ones that I'm going to be discussing today, but we also have My Underground American Dream by Julissa Arce, The Undocumented Americans by Cornejo Villavicencio, which is pretty different story, and Solito by Javier Zamora, which was published last month, and to be honest, I haven't had time to, to read it yet. So today I'll be focusing on Reyna Grande and Diane Guerrero's memoirs. They both are two Latina authors belonging to mixed status families, as I will explain in a minute. But our first author, Reyna Grande, she was born in Guerrero, Mexico, and after several attempts, she migrated to the US at age 9, where she lived in Los Angeles with her father and her siblings. And in the past, she worked as a teacher, but then she became a very prolific author. You may see that she's published many novels, memoirs, and in fact, this year she published another novel, and she edited a volume of short stories on migration. And The Distance Between Us, which is the memoir that I'm focusing on today, it has two parts, and in the first part, Reyna Grande describes her story, her life living in Mexico with her grandparents and siblings, while her father and mother were working in the U.S. And then the second part narrates her migration to the U.S. And the process until she becomes the first person to earn a university degree in her family, and her struggle to negotiate her identity and to stay as a united family. On the other hand, we have Diane Guerrero, who's a Colombian-American actress and author. You may know her from series like Orange is the New Black or Jane the Virgin. She's also the host of the Yeah, No, I'm Not Okay podcast, which is about mental health. She interviews prominent people in the Latinx community, and they have interesting discussions about mental health and other issues. She's also the author of In the Country We Love, and the young adult adaptation of this novel, which was released in 2018. So today I'll be focusing on In the Country We Love, and it describes her years growing up in Boston. And the turning point in the novel comes when she, at age 14, when she comes home to an empty house because her parents have been deported, right? And she finds herself alone in the US. She decides to stay there on her own and pursue an acting career. And she also processes the baggage and the toll of migration and the distance with her parents. So even if their backgrounds and legal statuses differ, because I forgot to mention that Diane Guerrero was born in the US and therefore she's a US citizen, they both belong to mixed status families, and their experiences resonate at different levels, and they both portray migration as a really complex and multi-layered experience, and they also describe the emotional suffering that is behind that. Now, moving on to the analysis of both novels, we could say that the American dream is one of the main topics, or it's, as we know, it's related to upward social mobility, and owning a house is one of those big symbols of the dream. And in fact, that was the main motivation for both families to migrate. But however, for Reyna Grande, who, as I said, remained in Mexico while her parents were trying to make a living in the US, the US represents bad and good things simultaneously, right? As she says, I want to live in that perfect place. I want to have a father. I want to have a family. So on the one hand, it's this idea of progress, but at the same time, it's what hinders family unity, right? But soon, both families will realize that achieving this dream is tied to legal status, right? And therefore, achieving that status becomes a priority for both families. As Reyna Grande's father said, just because we are illegal doesn't mean we can dream. One way or another, we will stop living in the shadows. And Diane describes it as a safe passage out of hiding, a passport from the underworld, the next chapter, right? Well, but still, and aside from achieving the American dream, legal status affects many different areas of this family life in a way, and one of them is social status. While they are trying to make a living in the US, they face racism, rejection, and that makes them kind of question their belonging and their effort, right? Legal status at the same time affects family unity because from the very beginning there is both a physical and emotional distance between family members. So in the case of Reyna Grande, as I already mentioned, this is a clear example of a physical distance, yeah? And especially with her father, on those first years, her father is in the US and she's got a picture of him, which is called The Man in the Glass, and that picture is the only paternal figure that she has, right? So she has no interaction with him. And her mother does spend some time with them, but at the same time she's absent, and Reina seems to be resentful at her. And critics Muñoz and Vigil argue that this resentment may be due to patriarchal and heterosexist views on motherhood and on that idea of mothers having to be self-sacrificing women and so on, right? And Reina's mother failing to embody that. In the case of Diane Guerrero, family unity is permanently broken when her family is deported, right? So migration, aside from creating physical distance, may lead to emotional distance. At one point, Reina's parents and their relationship, and as I said, her mother is detached, and then at some point they all live in Los Angeles, but her mother lives with some of her siblings in a different house. And this is when Reina wonders, I looked at my 5-year-old sister and I wonder how long it would take us to finally feel like a family. So we have that emotional distance permanently there. So as we see, legal status shapes the lives of all family members. And that could be illustrative of the impact of the multi-generational punishment that I explained earlier. Yeah, where every member in these mixed status families experiences the consequences of living undocumented to some extent. And these consequences are long-lasting as the distance between these family members is permanent, yeah. I would say that the impact of undocumented status, quite perhaps ironically, is aggravated in Diane's case, yeah, because despite being a citizen, even after her family is deported, she is really afraid of standing out. She doesn't want to have any contact with the US authorities, and in fact, these authorities don't reach out to her either. And her mother advises her to stay hyper-vigilant, which creates understandably a high degree of distress, yeah, and also alienation, and that has a clear impact on her mental health. So both families experience the consequences of being undocumented, and they have limited interactions with society. They have this constant fear of deportation. They experience the stigma attached to undocumented status, and their sense of belonging is also affected. And that all has a negative impact on their mental health. So both novels also portray the relation between undocumented status and mental health, as they all face adversities that have an impact on their emotional well-being. And in Diane's case, her mother is deported twice, and after the second time, the tensions between her father and brother increase, and her brother's mental health worsens. And here, it's very interesting what Diane Guerrero has to say on her brother's mental health, because he is undocumented. She says, my brother fell into an emotional slump. He couldn't see a future for himself in this country. It's nearly impossible to dream big when you don't even have your legal papers. So in a way, she argues that one's sense of belonging is hindered by undocumented status. Yeah. And she also states that emotional wellness is a first world luxury. Yeah, and here she points at the job insecurity and the precariousness that migrants often face, and how that kind of hinders an assessment of one's, mental health. This cannot be a priority, right? So there are many factors that determine access to healthcare and mental health care, and socioeconomic status is obviously one of them. In Diane Guerrero's case, her hardest moment is when her family is deported, partly because it's a very abrupt situation. Well, her mother is deported first, but then one day she comes from school and she finds herself alone. And she also struggles with the visual and the, let's say, institutional criminalization of her parents, because once they are deported, they are taken to a deportation center and they are dressed as prisoners. And this has a huge impact on Diane, obviously. And even after the deportation, she still carries the guilt and the stigma attached to undocumented status, and her mental health deteriorates. Well, she's a teenager and she's in college, and that's also aggravated by the economic hardships that she's experiencing. And at one point, she contemplates suicide, but then fortunately, she recovers. Now, when comparing the portrayal of mental health issues in both novels, we could say that in Reyna Grande's novel, it's less explicit, and that could be due to the fact that this novel is focalized by the young version of Reyna Grande, yeah? But still, from the very beginning, Reyna and her siblings struggle with being abandoned, quote unquote, by their parents, by being called little orphans by the people in the town. And then they have a complicated relationship with their father. So as I said at the beginning, they don't have much contact with him. And then when they go to live with him in Los Angeles, they see that he has two faces. So the loving, the caring one, and also the abusive one. Indeed, they become victims of domestic abuse. And but then they realize that that their father was also a victim of domestic abuse himself. So in a way that shows that our limited access to mental health care can be devastating for people and for those around them as well, yeah. And towards the end, Reyna Grande also closes her memoir, but by pointing at the possible trauma that migration may have created or on her parents, when she states, I thought about the border that separates the United States and Mexico. I wondered if during their crossing, both my father and mother had lost themselves in that no man's land. I wondered if my real parents were still there, caught between two worlds. I imagined them trying to make their way back to us. I truly hoped that one day they would. Yeah. So to sum up, both novels show how migration and undocumented status affect one's emotional well-being. And among all factors, we could say that deportation and deportability, or the possibility of being deported, are the most devastating ones. But access to healthcare is also limited, and that can add up when people have lower socioeconomic status and when they are affected by social stigma surrounding both undocumented migration and mental health. But as I noticed in both novels, the younger generations, younger characters seem to be more aware of that stigma and the situation, and that could be understood as a positive shift. So to conclude, we could say that both the global situation and the migration laws pose multiple challenges to those who migrate, not only to the US, but to many different parts in the world. But in the US, recently, deportations and family separations have particularly affected the well-being of those who migrate, regardless of whether they are documented or undocumented. And well, this study has analyzed both Reyna Grande and Diane Guerrero's memoirs. And while Reyna grows up undocumented and Diane Guerrero is a citizen, they both belong to mixed status families, and they endure difficulties related to that undocumented status that their relatives have. And this analysis hopefully has shown that undocumented status poses some risks and fears that threaten the well-being of migrants, and they also go in line with studies across different disciplines that assess the impact of migration on one's mental health and the social stigma related to mental health. And, well, both protagonists experience physical and emotional distance that affect them in emotional terms, or that affect their emotional well-being negatively. As Reyna Grande says, and the title of my talk said, immigration took a toll on us all, right? So we could say that both novels make relevant contributions to the current debate on migration. They show multiple nuances related to migration that are far from being dehumanizing or stereotyped. And we could say that the protagonists managed to step out of the shadows of undocumented status and to some extent succeed in their version of the American dream, or at least in the most, let's say, material version of the American dream. They also question this good equals legal versus bad equals illegal dichotomy that exists in the immigration debate and that contributes to the criminalization of migrants. And by overcoming that dichotomy, they prove that there are many factors that determine that success at achieving the dream. They also show the need for migration and mental health policy reform, because as we've seen, being documented or a citizen does not ensure well-being when your family is surrounded by hardships. And there's also a pressing need to assess the well-being of migrants and to take a family-centered approach around this issue. And just as these narratives contribute to the healing process of the protagonists, they could be potentially inspiring for upcoming generations, and that may be why these novels and many others have been adapted for young adult readers. And this has been all. These are the works that I use, and thank you for listening.